Good morning and welcome to Sunday School for February 14th. Happy Valentine's Day to you all. My name is Brandon Keaton and I'm the Director of Music here at First Methodist Church. And today we're going to be continuing in a study that Laurel began last week. What is it? The Hypocrites and the Holy, I think, or something to that effect, because we've been looking at the book of James to begin with. And Laurel was dealing with the first half of chapter 2 of the letter to James, and then today we're going to look at the second half of that same chapter. James is such a practical book. You know, every time I listen to the book of James or read through the book of James, I hear echoes of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. There are so many similarities there. I think that's it's important to see that there is a familial resonance between the two. Of course, Jesus' brother, James, is the one who wrote this letter, and of course he was the one who became the leader of the church at Jerusalem not long after the resurrection. And so he remained there until his death as a martyr in, I believe it was 66 AD. He's a very righteous man and followed the law, but also was a true believer in Jesus. Well, we're going to dive in today to a lesson that I'm calling a faith that lives and works. And we're going to look at James chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith, I have deeds." Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. You believe that there is one God? Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. Well, so this is a heavy-hitting set of verses to begin with. So this, in the second chapter of James, this is his second example of the need to be consistent between our faith and our actions, between our words and our deeds. And in the process, he makes the argument that faith and works, or faith and deeds, are inseparable. That when we try to separate them, that's how we end up with inconsistency. So he opens this section with the two rhetorical questions. He starts with, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? So beginning here, it's clear that there are two particular benefits that James sees in faith, or that arise from faith. The first, of course, is in the second rhetorical question. Can such faith save them? So he basically believes that there are that faith has a benefit for you as a believer, that faith saves you, that faith, that arises in your heart, it's real and it's true. Okay, it's not a false faith. Even if you say you only just have faith and forget the works part, but faith provides not only the benefit of salvation to the one who possesses it, but also to others. It shows God's gift, God's goodness to others. So then, that's two things that we want to remember. That faith should be able to provide the benefit of salvation to us, those who possess the faith, but then it should provide or demonstrate the goodness of God to other peoples by what happens in our own lives. Okay, so the twofold concern for the good that faith should accomplish is an important reminder for us, especially in our individualistic culture. We oftentimes really think of what am I going to get out of this? That tends to be our reason to be. Often I think that we really do want to look out for number one, and that's usually us. And there's nothing wrong with looking out for yourself and being cautious for yourself and for your family and taking care of them. But it should never be at the risk of losing our faith. Because, I mean, when you think about it, what are we here on earth to do but to show the goodness of God to other people? And sometimes that means we have to deny ourselves and take up the cross and follow Him. Well, so, a lot of times, and I admit that that in my past life, I probably would have thought this as well, but when you see in verse 18, it says, "But someone will say, 'You have faith, I have deeds.'" Oftentimes we really hear, well, someone will claim, who claims to have faith. And so it insinuates that this claim is not a real faith, that it's not true. But James really does go to show, or tries to show us that that's not true. That that faith, that even that kind of faith can be genuine. Like here, for example, so, the particular details of this example in verses 15 and 16 show that the faith must be genuine because it has produced one of the results that James says has to be there for faith to be real. And of course, that's the one that affects us as believers. So when confronted by a destitute or a hungry person who is part of their congregation, it does say one of you. Whenever James says that person will say, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," well, this is basically a way of acknowledging that God's will is to take care of that person. Lots of times Jews in the first century would use the passive voice in order to avoid using the name of the Lord. So how you can read this is, "Go in God's peace, may God warm you and provide you with all the food you need." So when one would give this blessing, it indicates that they know what God's will is and that they understand that God's will is for that person to be well, to go in peace, to have peace, to be warmed, and to be filled. But James, can ask them what good has been accomplished by their knowledge of God's will if they do not act to meet what they know to be God's desire for the believer in need. So, our desire if our desire has become the same as God's desire, then how can we do nothing about their physical needs? So James is not denouncing the pronouncement of God's blessing on these people, on the poor, unfortunate soul, that they meet, who needs to be warmed and filled. He is only pronouncing failure, he's only denouncing the pronouncement or the failure to become servants of God's mercy, justice, and love. So it's not that he thinks that the faith is bad, it's just that we're not following through on it. If we know what God's will is, there is the passage that says, if we know what God's will is and we don't do it to us, that is sin. And so so this, of course, would be a sin of omission as opposed to a sin of commission. But a faith only spoken about and not accompanied by actions is dead, producing neither the physical benefit for others nor the benefit of salvation for ourselves. So the objection that James anticipates to his argument, what someone will say, is difficult to interpret since early Greek manuscripts, none of them have any punctuation marks. It's crazy, and all of them, all uses capital letters, and so when you read it, it's just letter, and there's not even any space between the words. Even so, it's very difficult to read. Thank God we have people who can, and not me. But so whenever you don't have punctuation marks and it says someone will say, the way that the NIV translates it, which is what is the version that I have been using, it says you have faith, semicolon, I have deeds. And this has James's rhetorical dialogue partner essentially concede the argument. However, the sense is probably to be understood as less specific than you, James, and I, the one making the objection, and more general in its reference. The New English Bible translates this, here is one who claims to have faith, and another who points to his deeds. So the point of the objection is that faith and deeds are separable. Of course, James doesn't believe that. That's his point. Another way that we could translate this would be, but someone will say, do you have faith? And I will respond, I have works. So the objection is that James's emphasis on deeds might imply that faith itself is of little or no importance. That is a powerful thought, to think that faith is not important. Just because you're doing the work, that you have no faith. James is getting that you have to have the faith that the works come out of that, and so you can't have one without the other. That's where it bothers him. It bothers James. So the objection is that James's emphasis on deeds might imply that, I want to say it again, might imply that faith itself is of little or no importance. But James responds that if his deeds are consistent with God's will rather than with his own desires, then they are proof that he has faith. So that means that trust in God will provide the wisdom he needs. On the flip side of that, if one does not have actions consistent with God's will, then his or her faith is still mingled with doubt. Now, doubt is not the worst thing in the world. Okay, it's not. Anything that requires faith also can cause doubt. But stepping out in faith, oftentimes, even in the midst of our doubt, is a way of showing that we trust God. James's conception of faith, primarily as a matter of trust in God's goodness, is central to understanding his argument from the unity of God. So NIV translates verse 19, you believe that there is one God. And it follows one group of manuscripts, that basically takes the statement as an intellectual to monotheism, to believe in one God. But you can also paraphrase this as you believe that there is one and only one God. But there are other manuscripts that that basically read this: you believe that God is one. And that is more in keeping with the unity of God. And this reading of it, you believe that God is one, is more likely to be the original because it's more compatible with what James was teaching. His emphasis on the consistency and unchangeableness of God. Whereas human beings have a nature that is divided between good and evil desires, God is one in the divine will and purpose. If the demons understand that God is unchangeable, his desires are unchangeable, his decrees and laws are unchangeable, that causes them to shudder, to be fearful in the face of judgment. And what they believe determines their actions, even if that doesn't lead them to submit to God's will. One's faith, what one truly believes, as opposed to what one professes to believe, is inseparably linked to one's actions. Now, I want you to hear that. Your faith, what you truly believe, as opposed to what you profess to believe, is linked to your actions. What you believe will lead you to act. If it does not lead you to act, then your faith is in something else. Well, moving on to verses 20 through 26, we continue the examples. You foolish person, Do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do, and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. This is a pretty harsh few verses. And so, he starts out with, this you foolish person. This literally means an empty person, a person who's empty. Most scholars look at this and they think that it has something to do with the Aramaic term for contempt that Jesus uses in Matthew chapter 5, raka, which means fool. Just as an aside, growing up in a very evangelical home, to say raka to someone just seems so dirty. No, it's funny when you think about it, but I digress. We won't say that anymore. But although the idea, most scholars see it as that, okay, at least, or that there's connotation there of intellectual weakness, dullness. So although the idea of intellectual deficiency is supported by this context, do you want evidence? The broader discussion here in chapter 2 of claims unsubstantiated by actions may point to the meaning foolish boasting. Of course, that is found in other Greek literature, and James uses that other places. And it may also be that James wants to suggest that claims of faith unsubstantiated by actions can only be empty words. The dialogue partner, that we don't see, is empty in the sense of lacking and deeds lacking of deeds with which to demonstrate his faith. So he doesn't have enough deeds or works to demonstrate his faith. Well, then there are two questions that need to be answered about James's use of Abraham and Rahab as illustrations or evidence for faith and works. What works did they perform for which they were considered righteous, and what does James mean when he says they were considered righteous? So, in response to the first question, several interpreters have sought to restrict actions or deeds to acts of mercy or Christian charity, and that's not really very good. Some are even going to suggest that James is not, in fact, concerned with faith and deeds, but only with expounding his earlier argument. I think that this is balderdash. Okay, I think that that's crazy. I think that he really is that this is a serious question, and it's a serious one that we have to deal with. While it's certainly true that acts of mercy are a major concern for James, back in chapter 1, verse 27, he defines pure religion as taking care of widows and orphans. Okay, so it's not like he is against Christian charity. It is strange that if he had wished to limit deeds to acts of Christian charity, why he would choose Abraham offering Isaac on the altar, and as far as that goes, why he would use Rahab, okay, for offering hospitality to the spies in Joshua. Well, if we look at the story of the binding of Isaac, which of course is the story that this is based on, several features suggest reasons why James may have chosen the specific incident to expand the definition of deeds beyond acts of mercy, or like we said, Christian charity. As both Genesis and the Jewish traditions regarding Abraham make clear, the call to offer Isaac was a test. And this test would seem to confirm James's readers' belief that God can be the source of testing. He talks about that in chapter 1. Consider it all joy when you fall into multiple temptations or multiple times of testing. So James James may want to emphasize another part of the Abraham tradition by making this incident the fulfillment of the quotation from Genesis 15:6. That Abraham believed God, of course, and it was credited to him for righteousness. James believed that faith was related to knowledge about God's goodness and trust that God will only give good things to those who ask in faith. Of course, he talks about this in James chapter 1. He may be suggesting that what made it possible for Abraham to accept God's will regarding the offering of Isaac was his belief that God would raise Isaac from the dead if he were sacrificed. And Hebrews chapter 11 makes that abundantly clear that he felt that way. And another feature of the story is important. When the angel of the Lord in Genesis 22:16 through 18, what he says, because you have done this, again, this is because you have been willing to offer Isaac as, that's a chapter, Genesis 22, where he is willing to offer Isaac his son. Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you because you have obeyed me. Literally, that means because you have heard my voice. So Abraham was blessed because he had done what he heard from the Lord's voice, just as James had earlier asserted that the one who is a doer of the word, or a doer of the work of the word planted in him rather than a forgetful hearer will be blessed in what he does. Deeds are not restricted to acts of mercy, then, but include all acts of obedience to God and to God's will. So it's in this sense that Abraham's faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. Well, if we return to the question of what James means by calling Abraham righteous or considering him righteous for what he did, the logical place to begin is with the use of the noun righteousness in verse 23. While there is no indication that James understood the statement, it was credited to him as righteousness as a forensic act, like Paul does, a forensic act of justification. Paul talks about this regularly in Romans chapter 4, throughout that whole chapter. James's rhetorical question in 2:14 makes it clear that to be considered righteous for what he did means that he was saved. So James is not merely arguing that a faith working with deeds is more righteous before or pleasing to God, or more pleasing to God. He is arguing that only faith and actions working together can save in that end times kind of a way, save us from sin, from judgment. What's at stake is salvation and justification. Being with the Lord. So James completes his appeal to the evidence of Abraham in verse 24 by contrasting the proper belief that a person is considered righteous by what they do with the improper belief that faith alone justifies a person. But it must be emphasized that the point stressed by this contrast is not that works alone justify a person. That's legalism. We don't want that. But that faith alone, the absence of a response in one's life, cannot justify us either. So thus, in James's theology, the presence of works or of actions is evidence both of the fact that we've received that wisdom from on high, that establishes the will to act, and of faith, which is prerequisite to receiving the gift of God, salvation, the wisdom that comes from Him. Similarly, James's allusion to the Rahab story, and we know this story about how that she met the spies from the Israelite camp in Jericho, and because she hid them, she was allowed to save herself and her family. And so his allusion to this story underscores his conviction that it is knowledge of God's goodness that leads to trust in Him, and ultimately to acts that accomplish God's will. So according to Joshua 2:1-21, of course, Rahab herself explained that the reason for her faith in God was that she had heard about all the things that God had done for the Israelites from the time they left Egypt. Her actions, when she conceals the spies, when she hides them, directly resulted in the saving of her life and the life of her family. Her faith led to actions that saved her from death. So Abraham and Rahab were common examples within the Jewish tradition about hospitality to strangers in particular. It's probable that James's readers would have made this connection, even though he does not use an explicit story of Abraham's hospitality. You know, the one that comes to my mind in particular would be the one where the three angelic beings that we think of as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit come to visit him before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which that is a far more explicit example of his hospitality. But James's two examples together serve to illustrate to us explicitly and implicitly his two interests in this part of the letter. You know, here they go. That faith necessarily leads to deeds is the explicit point of the Abraham example and the implicit point of the Rahab allusion. And that hospitality as an expression of God's concern for the poor is explicitly stated with regard to Rahab and implicitly illustrated by Abraham. So James's argument here concerns at the general level the translation of faith into appropriate actions, but at the particular level concerns the way in which the poor are treated within the community. So he can be talking about the poor in a specific community in particular and how they're treated. But his concern at the general level is how our faith translates into what we do. So James sums up his theology in the simile that concludes this chapter. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. The certain result of removing deeds from faith is just like taking the spirit out of the body. It dies. And so today, my charge to you is to find those areas that God is calling you to that will demonstrate your faith. And faith without works cannot be alive, but faith with works is alive and at work in our world today. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. Amen.